Free market capitalism is a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers work, produce, and exchange their products for the products of others through prices voluntarily arrived at. State capitalism consists of one or more groups making use of the coercive apparatus of the government for themselves by expropriating the production of others by force and violence. Murray N. Rothbard, The Logic of Action, from 1997. The late 19th and early 20th centuries are often referred to as the time of the robber barons. It is a staple of history books to attach this derogatory phrase to such figures as John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the great 19th century railroad operators Grenville Dodge, Leland Stanford, Henry Villand, and James J. Hill, and others. To most historians writing of this period, these entrepreneurs committed thinly veiled acts of larceny to enrich themselves at the expense of their customers. Once again, we see the image of the greedy, exploitative capitalist, but in many cases this is a distortion of the truth. As common as it is to speak of robber barons, most who use that term are confused about the role of capitalism in the American economy and fail to make an important distinction, the distinction between what might be called a market entrepreneur and a political entrepreneur. A pure market entrepreneur or capitalist succeeds financially by selling a newer, better, or less expensive product on the free market without any government subsidies, direct or indirect. The key to his success as a capitalist is his ability to please the consumer. For in a capitalist society, the consumer ultimately calls the economic shots. By contrast, a political entrepreneur succeeds primarily by influencing government to subsidize his business or industry, or to enact legislation or regulation that harms his competitors. In the mousetrap industry, for example, you can be a market entrepreneur by making a better mousetrap and thereby convincing consumers to buy more of your mousetraps and less of your competitors. Or you can lobby Congress to prohibit the importation of all foreign-made mousetraps. In the former situation, the consumer voluntarily hands over his money for the superior mousetraps. In the latter case, the consumer, not giving anything better in return, pays more for existing mousetraps just because the import quota has reduced supply and therefore driven up prices. The American economy has always included a mix of market and political entrepreneurs, self-made men and women, as well as political connivers and manipulators. And sometimes, people who have achieved success as market entrepreneurs in one period of their lives later become political entrepreneurs. But the distinction between the two is critical to make, for market entrepreneurship is a hallmark of genuine capitalism, whereas political entrepreneurship is not. It is neo-mercantilism. In some cases, of course, the entrepreneurs commonly labeled robber barons did indeed profit by exploiting American customers, but these were not market entrepreneurs. For example, Leland Stanford, a former governor and U.S. senator from California, used his political connections to have the state pass laws prohibiting competition for his Central Pacific Railroad. And he and his business partners profited from this monopoly scheme. Unfortunately, the resentment that this naturally generated among the public was unfairly directed at other entrepreneurs who succeeded in the railroad industry without any political interference that tilted the playing field in their direction. Thanks to historians who fail to or refuse to make this crucial distinction, many Americans have an inaccurate view of American capitalism. How to build a railroad. Most historians have assumed that the transcontinental railroads would never have been built without government subsidies. The free market would have failed to provide adequate capital, or so their theory asserts. The evidence for this theory is that the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, which were completed in the years after the war between the states, received per-mile subsidies from the federal government in the form of low-interest loans as well as massive land grants. But there need not be cause and effect here. The subsidies were not needed for the transcontinental railroads to be built. We know this because, just as many roads and canals were privately financed in the early 19th century, a market entrepreneur built his own transcontinental railroad. James J. Hill built the Great Northern Railroad, quote, without any government aid, even the right-of-way, through hundreds of miles of public lands being paid for in cash, close quote, as Hill himself stated. Quite naturally, Hill strongly opposed government favors to his competitors. Quote, the government should not furnish capital to these companies, in addition to their enormous land subsidies, to enable them to conduct their business in competition with enterprises that have received no aid from the public treasury. Close quote. This may sound quaint by today's standards, but it was still a hotly debated issue in the late 19th century. James J. Hill was hardly a baron or aristocrat. His father died when he was 14. He dropped out of school to work in a grocery store and for $4 a month helped support his widowed mother. As a young adult, he worked in the farming, shipping, steamship, fur trading, and railroad industries. He learned the ways of business in these settings, saved his money, and eventually became an investor and manager of his own enterprises. It was much easier to accomplish such things in the days before the income tax. Hill got his start in the railroad business when he and several partners purchased a bankrupt Minnesota railroad that had been run into the ground by the government-subsidized Northern Pacific. The Northern Pacific had a patronage reward to financier Jay Cooke, who in the war between the states had been one of the Union's leading financiers. But Cooke and his Northern Pacific associates built recklessly. The government subsidies and land grants issued on a per mile of track basis, so Cooke and his cohorts had strong incentives to build as quickly as possible, which only encouraged shoddy work. Consequently, by 1873, the Northern Pacific developers had fallen into bankruptcy. The people of Minnesota and the Dakotas, where the railroad was being built, considered Cooke and his business associates to be derelicts at best and thieves at worst, writes Hill biographer Michael P. Malone. It took Hill and his business partners 5 years to complete the purchase of the railroad, the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, which would form the nucleus of a road that he would eventually build all the way to the Pacific, the Great Northern. He had nothing but contempt for Cooke and the Northern Pacific for their shady practices and corruption, and he quickly demonstrated a genius for railroad construction. Under his direction, the workers began laying rails twice as quickly as the Northern Pacific crews had, and even at that speed built what everyone at the time considered to be the highest quality line. Hill micromanaged every aspect of the work, even going so far as to spell workers so that they could take much-needed coffee breaks. His efficiency extended into meticulous cost-cutting. He passed his cost reductions onto his consumers in the form of lower rates because he knew that the farmers, miners, timber interests, and others who used the rail services would succeed or fail along with him. His motto was, "We have got to prosper with you, or we've got to be poor with you." In keeping with his philosophy of encouraging the prosperity of the people residing in the vicinity of his railroad, Hill publicized his views on the importance of crop diversification to the farmers of the region. He didn't want them to become dependent on a single crop and therefore subject to the uncertainties of price fluctuation as the southern cotton farmers were. Hill also provided free seed grain and even cattle to farmers who had suffered from drought and land depression. He stockpiled wood and other fuels near his train depots so farmers could stock up when returning from a delivery to his trains, and he donated land to towns for parks, schools, and churches. He transported immigrants to the Great Plains for a mere $10 if they promised to farm near his railroad, and he sponsored contests for the beefiest livestock or the most abundant wheat. His model farms educated farmers on the latest developments in agricultural science. All of this generated goodwill with the local communities and was also good for business. Hill's rates fell steadily, and when farmers began complaining about the lack of grain storage space, he instructed his company managers to build larger storage facilities near his rail depots. He refused to join in attempts at cartel price fixing and in fact gloried in the role of a rate slasher and disruptor of price-fixing pooling arrangements, writes historian Burton Folsom. After all, he knew that monopolistic pricing would have been an act of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. In building his transcontinental railroad from 1886 to 1893, Hill applied the same strategy that he had used in building the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba. Careful building of the road combined with economic cultivation of the nearby communities. He always built for durability and efficiency, not scenery, as was sometimes the case with the government-subsidized railroads. He did not skimp on building materials, having witnessed what harsh Midwest winters could do to his facilities and how foolish it was for the Northern Pacific to have ignored this lesson. The solid granite arch bridge that Hill built across the Mississippi River was a Minneapolis landmark for many years. Burton Folsom describes Hill's compulsion for excellence. Hill's quest for short routes, low grades, and few curvatures was an obsession. In 1889, Hill conquered the Rocky Mountains by finding the legendary Marias Pass. Lewis and Clark had described a low pass through the Rockies back in 1805, but later no one seemed to know whether it really existed or, if it did, where it was. Hill wanted the best gradient so much that he hired a man to spend months searching western Montana for this legendary pass. He did in fact find it, and the ecstatic Hill shortened his route by almost 100 miles. Hill's Great Northern was, consequently, the, quote, best constructed and most profitable of all the world's major railroads, close quote, as Michael P. Malone points out. The Great Northern's efficiency and profitability were legendary, whereas the government-subsidized railroads, managed by a group of political entrepreneurs who focused more on acquiring subsidies than on building sound railroads, were inefficiently built and operated. Jay Cooke was not the only one whose government-subsidized railroad ended up in bankruptcy. In fact, Hill's Great Northern was the only transcontinental railroad that never went bankrupt. James J. Hill versus the real robber barons. By the summer of 1861, after the Battle of the First Manassas, it was apparent to all that the war between the states was going to be a long, drawn-out campaign. Nevertheless, in 1862, Congress, with the Southern Democrats gone, diverted millions of dollars from the war effort to begin building a subsidized railroad. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 created the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, the latter to commence on building in Sacramento, California, and the former in Omaha, Nebraska. For each mile of track built, Congress gave these companies a section of land, most of which was to be sold,